There's a special kind of evil that hides in plain sight, the kind that understands our most basic human instincts and weaponizes them against us. We see someone struggling on the street, someone who looks lost, vulnerable, invisible to the world. And in that moment, when compassion whispers that we should help, we never imagine that the person asking for mercy might be the very last face we ever see. This is the story of Mark Goudeau, the baseline killer. A man who understood that disguise isn't always about masks and makeup. Sometimes it's about becoming the person no one wants to look at, the person society has trained us to look away from. And in the shadows of Phoenix, Arizona, in the scorching summer of 2005, he used that invisibility to hunt. Phoenix in August. The desert city where temperatures climb to 115 degrees, where the asphalt shimmers with heat mirages, and where the sun burns so bright that shadows become precious commodities. It's a place where people move quickly from air-conditioned car to air-conditioned building, where eye contact on the street is brief, and where the homeless population blends into the landscape like another piece of desert scenery. On a Tuesday evening, August 2nd, a woman named Carmen Miranda walked to her car after her shift at a restaurant on South Baseline Road. Carmen was 37 years old. She had 2 children waiting for her at home. The street was busy, but not crowded. Just another Phoenix evening, the kind where the heat still radiates from the pavement even as the sun begins its descent. Surveillance footage would later show a figure approaching her. Not running, not chasing, just approaching. The way someone might approach if they needed directions, or spare change, or help. Carmen Miranda never made it home that night. Her body was found hours later, shot multiple times. But she wasn't the first, and she wouldn't be the last. To understand Mark Goudeau, you have to understand that evil doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. It doesn't always look like the monsters we see in movies. Sometimes it looks like a man born in Phoenix, in 1964, the second youngest of 8 children, growing up in a neighborhood where poverty and violence were as common as the desert heat. Mark Goudeau's childhood was unremarkable in its dysfunction. His father was largely absent. His mother struggled. The family moved frequently, always staying within the same rough neighborhoods of South Phoenix. There were no early warning signs that screamed future serial killer to the neighbors. No torturing of animals or setting fires. Just a quiet kid who seemed angry at the world, who got into fights, who couldn't quite figure out how to fit in anywhere. But beneath that ordinariness, something was growing. Something dark and patient and calculating. By the time he was a teenager, Goudeau had discovered violence as a solution to his problems. Minor assaults. Robberies. Nothing that made headlines, but enough to get him noticed by the juvenile justice system. And then, at 19 years old, he crossed a line that would define the rest of his life. In 1983, he kidnapped a woman at gunpoint, forced her into a car, drove her to a remote location, and for hours, he terrorized her. When he was caught and convicted, the judge sentenced him to over a decade in prison. 13.5 years for aggravated assault, armed robbery, and kidnapping. 13.5 years. That's a long time to think, to plan, to refine your anger into something sharper, something more focused. Prison doesn't rehabilitate everyone. Sometimes it's just a waiting room. In 2004, Mark Goudeau walked out of prison. He was 40 years old. He had served his time, paid his debt to society, as they say, and on paper, he seemed to be trying to rebuild his life. He got married to a woman named Wendy Carr. He found work as a construction laborer. He moved into a modest home in central Phoenix. His parole officers noted that he seemed compliant, quiet. He showed up for his meetings, passed his drug tests mostly. There were a few hiccups, some positive tests for cocaine, but nothing serious enough to send him back. He was just another ex-con trying to make it work in a system that makes it nearly impossible for people with records to succeed. But here's the thing about Mark Goudeau that nobody understood at the time. Prison hadn't changed him. It had crystallized him. All those years behind bars, all that time watching, learning, adapting, he hadn't been rehabilitating. He'd been preparing. Because unlike his younger self, who acted impulsively, who got caught quickly, The Mark Goudeau who walked free in 2004 was methodical, patient. He understood forensics now. He'd watched enough crime documentaries, heard enough prison yard talk to know how people got caught. DNA, fingerprints, witnesses, patterns. And so, when the darkness inside him finally broke through again in August of 2005, he was ready. The first attacks weren't murders. They were what the police would later call testing the waters. Sexual assaults, armed robberies. Goudeau would approach women, sometimes alone, sometimes in pairs, in the evening hours when the Phoenix heat finally began to ease. He'd ask for directions, for help, for a cigarette. His manner was non-threatening at first. Sometimes he'd dress in shabby clothes, looking homeless, looking harmless. Other times he'd wear a Halloween mask, something cheap from a dollar store. The masks were theatrical, but the homeless disguise, that was genius in its cruelty. Because we're taught not to stare at homeless people. We're taught to avert our eyes, to move past quickly, to pretend we don't see them. Goudeau understood this instinctively. The homeless person is the invisible person, and invisibility is the perfect camouflage for a predator. One survivor later described how he approached her near a bus stop. He looked disheveled, tired, his clothes worn and dirty. He asked if she knew the time. When she looked down at her watch, he pulled a gun. In seconds, her entire world changed. He forced her into her own car, drove her to a remote area, and assaulted her. She survived because someone interrupted him, a car pulling up nearby. He fled, leaving her traumatized but alive. She went to the police, gave a description. But the description was vague. A black man, medium height, medium build, possibly homeless. In a city of over 1 million people with a substantial homeless population, it was nearly useless. And Goudeau knew it. August turned to September. September to October. And the attacks continued. But they were escalating. What started as sexual assaults and robberies began to include something worse. Murder. The victims were women, mostly. Young women. Women in their 20s and 30s. Women like Carmen Miranda. Women who were just living their lives, going to work, coming home, existing in the world with a reasonable expectation that they were safe in their own city. There was Kristen Gibbons, 39 years old, found shot to death in a parking lot. There was Tina Washington, 39 years old, discovered in an empty lot, executed with a bullet to the head. There was Carol Kennedy, 42 years old, killed in a similar fashion. The murders were brutal in their efficiency. Most victims were shot multiple times, often in the head. There was no hesitation in these killings, no second thoughts. Just cold, calculated execution. And then Goudeau would disappear back into the city, back into his disguise of normalcy or homelessness, back into the crowd. Phoenix was starting to panic. The media began connecting the dots, linking cases that seemed similar in their methodology. The term baseline killer emerged because many of the crimes occurred near Baseline Road, a major east-west thoroughfare that cuts through South Phoenix. The baseline rapist became the baseline killer as the body count rose. But who was he? The police had witnesses, survivors who'd seen his face. They had descriptions. They even had composite sketches drawn by forensic artists based on those descriptions. But they didn't have a name. They didn't have DNA that matched anyone in the system from these new crimes, though they had DNA from the crime scenes. And without a suspect, without someone to compare it to, that DNA was just evidence waiting for a breakthrough. Meanwhile, Mark Goudeau went to work every day, came home to his wife, watched the news reports about himself, and kept hunting. There's a psychological profile that criminologists use for serial killers like Goudeau. They call them power-assertive offenders. These are killers who use violence to assert dominance, to feel in control, to compensate for deep-seated feelings of inadequacy and rage. They're often methodical, organized, and they learn from each crime, refining their technique. Dr. Michelle Ward, a forensic psychologist who has studied cases like this, once explained it this way: these offenders aren't insane in the legal sense. They know right from wrong. They simply don't care. To them, other people aren't really people. They're objects. tools to satisfy a need. And that need, fundamentally, is about power. Mark Goudeau fit this profile perfectly. His crime showed planning, patience, and a chilling ability to compartmentalize. He could assault and murder someone in the evening, then go home and sleep peacefully beside his wife. He could maintain a job, show up on time, interact normally with coworkers, all while carrying the weight of multiple murders. This wasn't a man who was spiraling out of control, despite what his escalating violence might suggest. This was a man who was deeply, perfectly in control, and that made him even more dangerous. By the spring of 2006, Phoenix was a city on edge. The baseline killer had now been linked to at least 9 murders and over a dozen sexual assaults. The police had formed a task force of hundreds of officers, all dedicated to catching this one predator. Tips poured in by the thousands. Every strange man, every unusual behavior, every shadow became a potential suspect. But Goudeau remained free. He'd learned to be careful. He varied his location slightly, though he stayed mostly in South Phoenix where he knew the streets, knew the rhythms, knew where people would be vulnerable. He wore gloves now, more conscious of fingerprints. He chose victims who were alone, who wouldn't have backup, who wouldn't be immediately missed. And he continued using his disguises. The homeless appearance was his favorite. It gave him a reason to be anywhere at any time. Homeless people wander. They sit on street corners, they walk through neighborhoods, they exist in public spaces without anyone questioning why they're there. It was the perfect cover. One detective later said, "We were looking for a monster, but monsters don't actually look like monsters. They look like everyone else." And in this case, he looked like someone we'd been trained to overlook. The break in the case came from an unexpected direction. In June of 2006, 2 sisters were walking home from a party when Goudeau attacked them. He forced them into a vehicle at gunpoint, drove them to an isolated area, and sexually assaulted both of them. But unlike many of his previous victims, these women fought back. They memorized details. They studied his face, his voice, his mannerisms. They survived. And when they spoke to the police, when they worked with the forensic artist to create a composite sketch, something clicked. The sketch was detailed, specific. It showed a man with distinctive features, a certain shape to his face, a particular way of holding himself. The sketch was released to the media. And within days, tips started coming in from people who thought they recognized the man in the picture. One of those tips came from someone who'd seen Mark Goudeau in the neighborhood. Another came from someone who knew he had a criminal record, that he'd done time for similar crimes. The police began surveillance. They watched Goudeau's home. They followed him to work. They collected DNA samples from items he'd discarded, a cigarette butt here, a coffee cup there. And when the DNA came back, it matched. The evidence from multiple crime scenes pointed to the same person, Mark Goudeau. On September 6, 2006, Mark Goudeau's 42nd birthday, Phoenix police surrounded his home in central Phoenix. It was early morning, the sun just beginning to heat the city for another scorching day. Officers in tactical gear approached the door. They'd rehearsed this moment, planned for every contingency. They knew they were confronting a man who'd killed at least 9 people, who'd shown no mercy to any of his victims. When they knocked, Wendy Carr answered the door. She looked confused, frightened. The officers pushed past her, weapons drawn, shouting commands. And there, in the bedroom, they found Mark Goudeau. He was just waking up, groggy and disoriented. He didn't fight, didn't run, didn't resist. He simply put his hands up and allowed himself to be arrested. His wife screamed. She didn't believe it. Couldn't believe it. The man she'd married, the man she'd shared a home with, couldn't be the baseline killer. It was impossible. He was with her most nights. He had a job. He was normal. But the evidence didn't lie. Goudeau's DNA matched samples from multiple crime scenes. Ballistics tests showed that the same gun had been used in several of the murders, and that gun was linked to Goudeau. Witnesses identified him from photo lineups. Survivors pointed at him in court and said, "That's him. That's the man who attacked me." The trial was a media spectacle. It began in 2009 and stretched over months. Prosecutors presented over 100 pieces of evidence, from DNA to ballistics to eyewitness testimony. They painted a picture of a methodical, remorseless killer who'd terrorized Phoenix for nearly a year. Goudeau's defense team argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that witnesses were unreliable, that the police had tunnel vision and focused on their client to the exclusion of other suspects. But their arguments fell flat against the mountain of forensic evidence. In the courtroom, Mark Goudeau showed little emotion. He sat quietly, dressed in a suit, looking more like a businessman than a serial killer. He occasionally took notes. He whispered with his attorneys. But he never showed remorse. Never shed a tear. Never looked at the families of his victims with anything resembling regret. One by one, the families of the victims took the stand during the penalty phase. They spoke about their daughters, their sisters, their mothers. They described the holes left in their lives, the birthdays and holidays celebrated in absence, the constant wondering of what might have been if their loved ones had lived. Carol Kennedy's daughter spoke about how her mother had been her best friend, how they'd talked every day, how she'd had to explain to her own young children why Grandma wasn't coming to visit anymore. Carmen Miranda's children described the confusion and terror of losing their mother, of having to grow up without her guidance, without her love. Tina Washington's sister talked about the nightmares, the fear that gripped her every time she walked to her car alone, the way the city she'd grown up in no longer felt safe. Through it all, Mark Goudeau remained impassive. If the stories affected him, he didn't show it. And perhaps that was the most chilling thing of all. His complete inability, or refusal, to connect with the suffering he'd caused. In November of 2010, the jury returned their verdict: guilty on all counts. 9 counts of first-degree murder, multiple counts of sexual assault, kidnapping, armed robbery. The list went on, a recitation of horror. And then came the penalty phase. Would Mark Goudeau receive life in prison or death? The jury deliberated. They considered the brutality of the crimes, the lack of remorse, the danger he posed to society. And they decided death. 9 death sentences. 1 for each life he'd taken. When the judge read the sentence, there was silence in the courtroom. And then, slowly, quietly, some of the family members began to cry. Not from joy, but from exhaustion. From relief that it was finally over. From grief that no sentence could ever bring their loved ones back. Mark Goudeau showed no reaction. He was led out of the courtroom in chains, back to a cell where he would wait for an execution date that, in Arizona's slow-moving legal system, might be years or even decades away. But the story doesn't end there. Because Wendy Carr, Goudeau's wife, refused to accept his guilt. In 2007, she launched a website proclaiming his innocence. She argued that he'd been framed, that the police had needed a scapegoat, that her husband was a good man who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time. She pointed to the fact that he'd passed a polygraph test, though polygraph results aren't admissible in court and are widely considered unreliable. She questioned the DNA evidence, suggesting contamination or mishandling. She maintained that Mark was with her during some of the times when murders occurred, providing him with an alibi. But investigators had checked those alibis. They'd found inconsistencies, gaps in the timeline where Goudeau couldn't be accounted for. And more importantly, the physical evidence was overwhelming. DNA doesn't lie. Ballistics don't lie. And the testimonies of multiple survivors, people who'd looked into Mark Goudeau's eyes as he held a gun to their heads, those testimonies were consistent and credible. Still, Wendy persisted. And in a strange way, her devotion was almost touching if misguided. She couldn't reconcile the man she knew, or thought she knew, with the monster described in court. It's a phenomenon psychologists call cognitive dissonance, the inability to hold 2 contradictory beliefs simultaneously. Either her husband was a serial killer, which meant her entire relationship with him was based on a lie, or he was innocent, which meant the world was conspiring against them. For Wendy, the second option was easier to accept, because the alternative was too painful. Today, Mark Goudeau sits on death row in Arizona. He's filed appeals, as is his right, arguing various procedural errors and constitutional violations. So far, those appeals have been unsuccessful. In February of 2025, the Arizona Supreme Court upheld his death sentences, finding no reversible error in his trial or sentencing. But beyond the legal proceedings, there's a deeper question that haunts everyone who studies this case. How did he get away with it for so long? How did a convicted violent offender, someone with a known history of kidnapping and assault, manage to live freely in society and commit such heinous crimes for nearly a year before being caught? Part of the answer lies in the sheer volume of violent crime in major cities. Phoenix police were dealing with hundreds of cases at any given time. Connecting disparate crimes, especially when they occur across a large geographic area, requires resources, time, and often a bit of luck. Part of it lies in the forensic technology of the time. In 2005 and 2006, DNA databases were less comprehensive than they are now. Surveillance cameras were less common, less sophisticated. Cell phone tracking wasn't the powerful tool it would become. Goudeau operated in a moment where he could still slip through the cracks. But part of it, perhaps the largest part, lies in his understanding of human psychology. He knew how to blend in. He knew how to choose victims who were vulnerable, isolated, unlikely to be missed immediately. And he knew how to weaponize our collective guilt and discomfort about homelessness. Because when he dressed as a homeless person, he became invisible. We don't want to see the homeless. They remind us of systems that are broken, of our own precarious position in the economic order, of the fine line between housed and unhoused. And so we look away. We train ourselves to look away. Mark Goudeau understood this, and he exploited it with devastating efficiency. The legacy of the baseline killer extends beyond his victims and their families, though their pain is paramount and should never be minimized. It extends to an entire city that had to reckon with its own vulnerability, with the realization that monsters can walk among us undetected. Phoenix changed after Goudeau's arrest. Surveillance systems were upgraded. Police protocols for connecting serial crimes were revised. Community awareness programs were implemented. The city learned in the hardest way possible that safety is not guaranteed, that vigilance is necessary, that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. But there's another legacy, one that's harder to quantify. In the years since Goudeau's arrest, there's been increased attention to how we treat and view homeless populations. Not because we should fear them. The vast majority of homeless individuals are far more likely to be victims of violence than perpetrators, but because our tendency to dehumanize and ignore them creates blind spots that predators can exploit. Criminologist Dr. Robert Hare, who developed the psychopathy checklist, once noted that successful predators are often those who understand social norms well enough to manipulate them. They find the gaps in our awareness, the places where we let our guard down, the moments when we're most vulnerable because we believe we're safe. Mark Goudeau found those gaps. And for 10 terrible months, he moved through them like a ghost, leaving devastation in his wake. Let's talk about the survivors, because they're the ones who rarely get enough attention in these stories. We focus on the dead, on the victims who can't speak for themselves, and rightly so. But the people who encountered Mark Goudeau and lived, who carry the trauma of those encounters every single day, they have stories too. One survivor, whose name was withheld from public records, described the moment when Goudeau approached her. She was walking to her car after work. It was dusk. The parking lot was mostly empty. She'd noticed a man sitting against a wall nearby, looking disheveled, possibly homeless. She'd felt a pang of sympathy. And then he stood up. And everything changed. He moved fast, much faster than she expected. He had a gun before she could process what was happening. Her first thought, she said, wasn't fear. It was confusion. Like her brain couldn't quite accept the reality of what was occurring. And then the adrenaline hit. He forced her into her car. Started driving. She tried to memorize the route, tried to note landmarks, tried to do everything the self-defense classes had taught her. But mostly she tried to survive. She talked to him, tried to humanize herself, told him about her family, her kids. She begged. He didn't respond. He was silent, focused, methodical. Like she wasn't even there. Like she was just an object to be used. She survived because of luck. A car pulled up near where he'd parked, interrupting whatever he'd planned. He fled, leaving her there, traumatized but alive. And when the police came, when they asked her to describe him, she realized something terrible. She could barely remember his face. Not because he was forgettable, but because she'd been so focused on survival that her brain hadn't properly recorded his features. It's a common phenomenon. Trauma interferes with memory formation. The brain prioritizes survival over recording details. And so, paradoxically, the people who need to remember the most are often the ones who remember the least clearly. But she did remember enough to work with the forensic artist. And her composite sketch, combined with others, eventually contributed to Goudeau's identification. Her survival mattered not just for her own sake, but for the sake of all the potential future victims she helped prevent. There's a question that everyone asks in cases like this. Could it have been prevented? If Mark Goudeau had been supervised more closely during his parole, if the system had been more attentive, could 9 people still be alive? It's an impossible question to answer definitively. Hindsight is perfect, but foresight is murky. Parole officers carry massive caseloads. They're overworked, underpaid, and dealing with hundreds of offenders simultaneously. They can't watch everyone every minute of every day. But there were warning signs. Goudeau had tested positive for cocaine multiple times during his parole period. He'd been convicted of violent, sexually motivated crimes in the past. He fit the profile of someone at high risk for reoffending. Should the system have done more? Yes. Could the system have done more? Probably. Would it have made a difference? We'll never know. What we do know is that the criminal justice system, like any large bureaucratic institution, has cracks. People slip through those cracks all the time. Most of them don't go on to become serial killers. Most of them struggle, maybe reoffend in smaller ways, maybe eventually stabilize. But some of them, a tiny percentage, become something worse. Mark Goudeau was in that tiny percentage. And Phoenix paid the price. In 2013, 7 years after Goudeau's arrest, Phoenix police made an unexpected discovery. A cold case detective named Sarah Wilson was going through old evidence from unsolved sexual assaults, looking for anything that might benefit from modern DNA analysis. She found a rape kit from 1985, almost 30 years old, still sitting in evidence storage. The case had gone cold long ago. The victim, whose name was never released, had been attacked by a stranger, assaulted, and left traumatized. Police at the time had taken her statement, collected evidence, but had never been able to identify a suspect. Eventually, the case had been filed away, one of thousands of unsolved crimes gathering dust in storage rooms. Detective Wilson sent the evidence for DNA testing, using technology that hadn't existed in 1985. And when the results came back, they showed a match. The DNA belonged to Mark Goudeau. He would have been 21 years old at the time of that assault, 2 years before his first known conviction, which meant his pattern of violence went back even further than anyone had realized. The baseline killer's crimes hadn't started in 2005. They'd started decades earlier. This revelation was both stunning and unsurprising. Stunning because it added yet another victim to Goudeau's count, another life forever, altered by his violence. Unsurprising because serial offenders rarely start at the level of their most infamous crimes. They build up to it. They test boundaries, refine techniques, escalate gradually. Mark Goudeau's trajectory of violence spanned over 20 years. The man who walked out of prison in 2004 hadn't been rehabilitated because he'd never stopped being dangerous. He'd simply been contained for a while. And when that containment ended, he picked up exactly where he'd left off. There's a moment in every true crime story where you have to step back and ask, why are we fascinated by this? Why do we consume these stories, listen to these podcasts, watch these documentaries? Is it morbid curiosity? Is it a desire to understand evil? Is it fear management, a way of preparing ourselves for dangers we hope we'll never face? Maybe it's all of those things. But maybe it's also something deeper. Maybe we're drawn to these stories because they remind us of our own fragility, our own mortality, the randomness of life and death. Carmen Miranda didn't do anything wrong when she walked to her car that August evening. She was just existing, moving through the world, entitled to the basic expectation of safety. And that safety was violated in the most fundamental way. It could have been anyone. That's what makes these stories so compelling and so terrifying. The victims weren't targeted because of who they were specifically. They were targeted because they were there, because they were vulnerable, because a predator decided it was their time. We tell ourselves that we would do things differently, that we'd be more careful, more aware, less trusting. But the truth is, we can't live our lives in a constant state of hypervigilance. We have to trust that the stranger asking for directions is just a stranger asking for directions. We have to believe that our cities are safe enough to walk in, that our parking lots won't become crime scenes, that the person approaching us is probably harmless. Most of the time we're right. Most strangers are harmless. Most days are safe. But every once in a while we're wrong. And people like Mark Goudeau are the reason why. Let's talk about the death penalty. Because it's impossible to discuss Mark Goudeau without addressing it. He's been sentenced to death 9 times. As of 2025, he's still alive, still housed on death row in Arizona, still filing appeals. The death penalty is one of the most divisive issues in American criminal justice. Supporters argue that some crimes are so heinous, so fundamentally evil, that death is the only appropriate punishment. They point to cases like Goudeau's and say, what else can you do with someone like this? Someone who showed no mercy, who killed without remorse, who would almost certainly kill again if given the opportunity. Opponents argue that the death penalty is applied inconsistently, that it disproportionately affects minorities and the poor, that it's more expensive than life imprisonment, and that it doesn't deter crime. They point to the numerous cases of wrongful convictions of innocent people sent to death row and ask, is the system reliable enough to entrust with the power to kill? Both sides have valid arguments. But in Mark Goudeau's case, there's little question about guilt. The evidence was overwhelming. Multiple independent sources of DNA, ballistics, eyewitness testimony from survivors. He was, in legal terms, caught dead to rights. Does that mean he should die? That's not for me to say. What I can say is that the families of his victims, the people who loved Carmen Miranda and Carol Kennedy and Tina Washington and the 6 others, they deserve justice. They deserve to know that the man who shattered their lives will never walk free again. Whether that justice comes in the form of execution or life imprisonment without parole is ultimately a question for society to answer. But what's not in question is that Mark Goudeau represents an absolute failure of human potential. A person who had every opportunity to choose differently and instead chose again and again to cause harm. In the end, the story of Mark Goudeau, the baseline killer, is a story about masks. Not just the literal Halloween masks he sometimes wore, though those are part of it, but the metaphorical masks we all wear, the personas we present to the world, the gap between who we are and who we pretend to be. Goudeau wore many masks. He was the ex-con trying to rebuild his life. He was the construction worker, showing up on time, doing his job. He was the husband, coming home to his wife each night. He was the homeless man on the street corner, invisible and unthreatening. But beneath all those masks was the reality. A predator. A killer. Someone fundamentally incapable of empathy or remorse. The terrifying thing is how well those masks worked. Wendy Carr lived with him, slept beside him, shared meals with him, and never saw what he truly was. His co-workers worked alongside him and saw nothing unusual. His parole officers checked in on him and saw a compliant ex-con. We want to believe that evil is obvious, that we'd recognize it if we encountered it. But the truth is far more unsettling. Evil often looks normal. It blends in. It says the right things, makes the right gestures, performs the rituals of ordinary life while harboring something monstrous beneath the surface. And sometimes, evil doesn't even bother with an elaborate disguise. Sometimes it just dresses as someone we've been trained not to see. Someone homeless. Someone struggling. Someone invisible. Mark Goudeau understood that our compassion, our discomfort, our tendency to look away from suffering could all be weaponized. And for 10 months in Phoenix, he used that understanding to hunt. It's been nearly 20 years since Mark Goudeau's arrest. The city of Phoenix has moved on, as cities do. New buildings have risen. New people have arrived. The streets where his victims died are now traveled by people who've never heard of the baseline killer. But the families remember. They'll never forget. Every year on their loved ones' birthdays, on the anniversaries of their deaths, they remember. They visit graves. They look at old photographs. They tell their children and grandchildren stories about the women who were taken too soon. And the survivors remember. The women who encountered Mark Goudeau and lived. They carry those encounters with them every day. Some have moved away from Phoenix, unable to bear living in the city where they were attacked. Others have stayed, determined not to let him take anything else from them. But all of them are changed, forever marked by their brush with evil. This is the real legacy of serial killers. Not the infamy, not the headlines, not the books and documentaries. The real legacy is the ripples of trauma that extend outward from each victim, touching families, friends, communities. The real legacy is the lives that were ended and the lives that were forever altered. Mark Goudeau is just one man, sitting in a cell, waiting. But the harm he caused is infinite, multiplying through time, affecting people who haven't even been born yet. Children who will grow up without mothers or grandmothers. Families fractured by grief that never quite heals. If there's a lesson to take from this story, it's not a comforting one. It's not that justice always prevails or that good conquers evil or that the system works. Sometimes justice prevails slowly, after too much harm has already been done. Sometimes evil isn't conquered so much as contained. Sometimes the system fails and people die because of those failures. The lesson, if there is one, is simpler and harder. Pay attention to the people around you, to the patterns in your community, to your instincts when something feels wrong. Don't assume that safety is guaranteed or that evil will announce itself clearly. But also, don't lose your humanity in the process. Don't become so suspicious that you can't extend kindness to strangers. Don't let the existence of predators like Mark Goudeau turn you into someone who sees threats everywhere. Because that would be letting him win, in a way. Letting him transform not just his victims but all of us into people who are afraid, who are closed off, who won't help someone who might genuinely need it. It's a difficult balance. Being aware but not paranoid. Being cautious but not cruel. Being open